When discussing the Trojan War, male heroes such as Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus tend to take center stage. But what about the women who were left widowed? Andromache and Penelope were not simply victims of circumstance. Their stories, described in ancient Greek epics, are masterclasses in survival and regaining power in a world where women were often deprived of their rights. Now we will reveal how these legendary figures used their intelligence, cunning, and strategy to outmaneuver men and regain control of their destinies, offering valuable lessons for modern audiences. Subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and let's get started. When we think of Andromache, the tragic scene of her farewell to Hector at the Scaean Gate comes to mind. Tears, pleas to stay, fear for her husband and young son. This image, which has become ingrained in our culture, paints a portrait of a loving but grief-stricken woman. However, Homer gives us something much more in the 6th song of the Iliad. A heavy sigh escaped from Andromache's breast. She shed a tear, and, touching him with her hand, she spoke and called out, "My husband, your courage will be your undoing. You have no pity for your infant son and for me, unhappy woman. I will soon be a widow." This is the beginning of their dialogue. Everything seems to be going according to a predictable scenario, but the emotional outburst is followed by a cold, calculated analysis. Andromache does not simply beg Hector not to take risks. She offers him a specific military tactic. She points out the weakest spot in Troy's defenses, the section of the wall near the wild fig tree. This is not a random guess by a frightened woman. She argues her case by reminding him that it is here that the mightiest of the Achaeans, including both Ajaxes and the famous Diomedes, have already tried to break through 3 times. She says, "Place your militia by the wild fig tree, where the city is most convenient and accessible for attack by enemies." The wife of Troy's greatest warrior, a woman whose sphere should be the home and the loom, demonstrates a deep knowledge of the military history of sieges and the topography of defensive structures. She knows where previous attacks have taken place. She understands what tactics the enemy is most likely to use. This is the level of a military advisor, not just a grieving spouse. Hector, listening to her, does not dismiss her. He takes her words seriously, even though he ultimately makes a different decision, dictated by his warrior's code of honor. The very fact that such a dialogue could take place and was recorded by Homer speaks volumes. Andromache's role in the defense of Troy was not passive. She was its brain center, its eyes and ears, an analyst whose opinion carried weight. While Andromache used her mind to give direct advice, Penelope, queen of Ithaca, waged a long-term campaign of psychological warfare from a much more vulnerable position. Her palace had been captured. 108 insolent and gluttonous suitors demanded her hand, and with it Odysseus's throne. They feasted at her expense, ruined her home, and openly plotted to kill her son Telemachus. She had no army, no defender. She had only her mind and her loom. Night falls on Ithaca. In the great hall of the palace, the torches go out, and the drunken chatter of the suitors dies down. Only a single lamp burns in the women's quarters. Penelope sits before a huge loom. During the day, in full view of everyone, she diligently weaves thread after thread into a burial shroud for her father-in-law, the old man Laertes. "As soon as I finish this work," she says to the suitors with a humble look, "I will choose a new husband." And they wait. They see the cloth growing, but they do not see what is happening here in the silence of the night. The fingers that wove so skillfully during the day now unravel their work with the same precision, thread by thread, row by row. This is not the work of mourning. It is an act of sabotage. Every knot she unties is another day won, another tiny victory in the war of attrition. This trick with the shroud is not just a beautiful legend.
It is a brilliant strategy that worked for 3 whole years. Penelope wasn't just stalling for time. She set the rules of the game. She took control of the main resource, time, and forced the men to play by her rules. She turned a traditional female occupation, weaving, into a weapon. The shroud for Laertes became a symbol of her power. She controlled its creation and, therefore, her own destiny. She did not engage in open confrontation, understanding its futility. Instead, she used their own expectations and social norms against them. To refuse to pay the last debt to her father-in-law was an unheard-of dishonor that even they would not commit. Penelope found the only loophole in the patriarchal system and turned it into an impregnable fortress. She manipulated 100 armed men without leaving her chambers. Therefore, to call these women simply victims is to miss the essence of their stories. These are not stories of passive suffering. These are chronicles of sophisticated intellectual resistance. To claim that they simply waited passively for their fate is to completely ignore the text and deny them the strength and cunning that Homer himself generously endowed them with. But Andromache's story does not end with the fall of Troy and the death of Hector. On the contrary, this is where her own Odyssey begins, a journey from rock bottom, from the status of war booty to the position of co-founder of a new kingdom. Her story after Troy, recorded in the tragedies of Euripides and in Virgil's Aeneid, is a hymn to fortitude and strategic survival in the most unimaginable conditions.
After the division of the spoils, Andromache is given to Neoptolemus, or Pyrrhus, the son of Achilles, the murderer of her husband. It is difficult to imagine a more cruel irony of fate. She becomes a concubine in the house of the enemy, forced to share a bed with the offspring of the man who took everything from her. In this situation, anyone else would have broken down and turned into a silent shadow, but not Andromache. She gives birth to Neoptolemus's son, Molossus. This is not an act of submission, but an act of rooting. In a foreign land, in the house of her enemy, she creates a new branch of her life, securing at least some status for herself through motherhood. Her son becomes her only capital, her only hope. Her situation is exacerbated when Neoptolemus brings his lawful wife, Hermione, daughter of Menelaus and Helen, into the house. A classic palace intrigue begins, in which a childless captive concubine opposes a jealous and arrogant queen. Hermione, childless and envious, sees Andromache and her son as a threat. She accuses the Trojan woman of witchcraft, of making her barren. It is a deadly game. Hermione has the full power of Sparta behind her. Her father is a victorious king. Andromache has nothing but her mind and dignity. In Euripides' tragedy Andromache, we see her in action. She seeks refuge at the altar of Thetis, her son's great-grandmother, appealing to divine law. She engages in a dialogue with Hermione and Menelaus, full of veiled barbs and bitter truths, reminding them that their own greatness is built on the ruins of her home. She does not ask for mercy, she demands justice, turning her weakness into moral strength. She survives this battle not through strength, but through her ability to use the laws and beliefs of her enemies against them. The culmination of her journey comes after the death of Neoptolemus.
According to one version, he bequeaths her freedom and gives her in marriage to his comrade in arms and fellow Trojan captive, Helenus, the brother of her first husband, Hector. In an instant, her world is turned upside down. From a slave, she becomes a queen again. But this is not just a return to status. Together with Helenus, a seer and ruler, she founds a new kingdom in Epirus. They build a city that Virgil describes as Little Troy, with a replica of the citadel of Pergamum and a river named after Xanthus. This is her ultimate victory. She did not just survive. She did not just regain her power. She did the impossible. She resurrected Troy from the ashes. Not on her native soil, but in the hearts, culture, and names of streets and rivers of her new home. Andromache, who lost her husband, son, and homeland, became the foremother of a new dynasty, the dynasty of the kings of Epirus, to which Alexander the Great himself later traced his lineage. She outplayed fate, turning her complete destruction into a new starting point. Let us return to Ithaca, where Penelope wages her own equally sophisticated war. Her strategy was not limited to the shroud alone. It was multi-layered and touched on all aspects of palace life. Penelope was not simply a recluse in her chambers. She was the eminence grise who controlled a complex network of people loyal to her. Her main weapon was information. Consider her intelligence network. The key figure was the old nurse Eurycleia. She was more than a servant. She was the living memory of the house, the keeper of its secrets. She was the first to recognize Odysseus when he returned, by the scar on his foot. But until that moment, she was Penelope's eyes and ears, reporting to her every word and every conspiracy of the suitors. Other important agents were the swineherd Eumaeus and the cowherd Philotas. These simple men, far removed from the intrigues of the palace, remained steadfastly loyal to their absent master. Penelope maintained this loyalty for years, managing her household from a distance. She could not give direct orders, but she created an atmosphere in which loyalty to the old order was the highest virtue. This is the subtle art of management, based not on fear, but on authority and respect. Another stroke of genius was her work with Telemachus. She saw her son transform from a boy into a young man, and understood that he was the next target of the suitors. As long as he was a child, he was safe. But as soon as he became a contender for power, his life was in danger. So, what does Penelope do? She initiates his coming of age. Encouraged by Athena, who, in essence, is often a projection of the hero's inner wisdom, Penelope supports Telemachus's decision to go in search of his father. From a strategic point of view, this was a multi-purpose maneuver. First, she physically removed her son from harm's way. The suitors were planning to ambush and kill him, but his departure threw a spanner in the works. Second, the journey was necessary for Telemachus himself. He had to step out of his mother's shadow, meet the heroes of the Trojan War, Nestor, Menelaus, and assert himself as Odysseus' heir. He left as an insecure young man and returned as a man ready to stand alongside his father. Penelope sacrificed her peace of mind, remaining alone to invest in the future of her son and her kingdom. We must not forget the economic war she waged. The suitors were ruining her household, eating her flocks and drinking her wine. Penelope found a way to turn this to her advantage. From time to time, she would descend into the banquet hall. She did not argue with them. She appeared, veiled, beautiful, and unapproachable, fueling their rivalry. And in one such moment, she utters a key phrase, reproaching them for not behaving as befits true suitors. True suitors, she says, bring rich gifts themselves, rather than squandering someone else's wealth. It was a subtle psychological jab at their male egos, and it worked. The suitors, striving to outdo each other, began to shower her with jewels, fabrics, and gold. In fact, Penelope forced them to partially compensate for the damage they had done to her household. She turned their greed and vanity into a source of income. And finally, the climax of her strategy, the bow contest. This was not a spontaneous decision by a desperate woman. It was a final, carefully thought-out gambit. Penelope herself announces the conditions. Whoever can draw Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads will become her husband. Why now? Because there is already a mysterious stranger in her house, whom she may have subconsciously recognized as her husband. But even if not, she creates a situation with only one possible outcome.
The task was impossible for anyone but Odysseus. She knew it, and everyone knew it. The bow was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of royal power, an extension of the king's own arm. None of the pampered suitors, accustomed to feasts rather than battles, could even bend it. Penelope was not simply choosing a husband. She was conducting a public test of legitimacy. She created a scene in which any impostor would suffer a crushing fiasco, and the true king could reveal himself to the world. She herself gave Odysseus the weapon of vengeance and the reason to begin it. She did not wait for him to decide to act on his own. She created the ideal conditions for his triumph, directing the bloody denouement. But even after Odysseus killed all the suitors and appeared before her in his true form, she did not throw himself into his arms. The most important moment arrives, proving that Penelope is not a prize, but an equal partner. She sets him one last, most important test, the bed test. She coldly orders her maid Euryclea to take Odysseus's marriage bed out of their bedroom and make it up for the guest. This statement infuriates Odysseus.
And in his rage, he reveals the main secret of their union. He himself, with his own hands, carved this bed from the trunk of a huge living olive tree, around which he built their bedroom. It is impossible to move this bed without cutting down the tree itself. Only the two of them knew this secret. At that moment, Penelope finally allows herself to believe. But what really happened? She did not simply verify his identity. She reminded him and herself of the foundation of their marriage and their kingdom. Their union is as unshakable and rooted in the land of Ithaca as this olive tree. She, the keeper of this sacred knowledge, performed the final inauguration. He could have regained his throne by force of arms, but he could only regain his wife and full power by passing her intellectual and emotional test. In this final dialogue, she established herself not as the object of his return, but as a co-ruler whose mind and loyalty had preserved what he had nearly lost. She gave him back not just his home, but the kingdom that had rested on her shoulders for all those 20 years. But what was going on in Penelope's own soul as she unraveled the threads of the shroud? Homer gives us the key to understanding her inner state. He describes her as a woman constantly immersed in tears and grief. But this grief is not a sign of weakness. It is her protective mask, her social armor. In a society where the widow of a hero was expected to be inconsolably grief-stricken, Penelope played this role masterfully. Her tears made her invisible to male analysis. Suitors saw her only as a broken woman mourning her husband, and therefore underestimated her cold, calculating mind. They could not have imagined that behind this veil of sadness lay a strategist who calculated their every move. Her grief was not only sincere, but also functional. It was a camouflage under which she carried out her subversive activities. Moreover, Penelope was a masterful user of language and rhetoric. When suitors became too insistent, she did not engage in direct confrontation with them. Instead, she appealed to the concept of kleos, glory and good name, which was central to the Greek heroic consciousness. She told them, "If you are truly noble men seeking glory, then your behavior is unworthy. You are ruining someone else's home instead of demonstrating your generosity." She beat them at their own game, questioning not their strength but their honor. For a man of that era, an accusation of dishonor was worse than a direct insult. In this way, she kept them in a constant state of moral discomfort, forcing them to justify themselves and prove their nobility, which distracted them from directly seizing power. And what about Andromache? Her story after the fall of Troy is not just one of survival, but of ascension, built on a deep understanding of dynastic politics. When she gives birth to Molossus, the son of Neoptolemus, she does more than just ensure her own safety. She weaves Trojan blood, the blood of Priam and Hector, into the family of the Aeacids, the descendants of Achilles. It was an act of symbolic reconciliation, and at the same time, a Trojan horse launched into the very heart of the enemy clan. Her son became the bearer of two great warring principles. This gave him and his descendants unique legitimacy. It is not surprising that the kings of Epirus and later Alexander the Great himself through his mother Olympias traced their ancestry back to Molossus. Alexander, the conqueror of Asia, was proud of his descent not only from Achilles, but also from the Trojans, whom he supposedly came to liberate from the Persian yoke. This ideological construct might never have come about without that first step taken by the captive Trojan woman Andromache, who bore a son to her enslaver. She did not simply survive, she laid the mythological foundation for future empires. Her marriage to Helenus was no less strategic. Helenus was not just a Trojan prince. He was a seer, a priest of Apollo. In the ancient world, this gave him enormous authority. The union of Andromache, the last queen of the true Troy, and Helenus, her spiritual leader, created a powerful center of legitimacy. Their little Troy in Epirus was not just a settlement of refugees. It was a government in exile, the spiritual and cultural center of the Trojan diaspora. When Aeneas, the future founder of Rome, visits them on his way to Italy, it is Helen who gives him key prophecies, and Andromache who gives him symbolic gifts, blessing his mission. She no longer acts as a victim, but as a guardian of heritage, passing the baton to the next generation of Trojan heroes. She became a living bridge between the ruined past and the great future that came to fruition in the Roman Empire. Penelope, in turn, demonstrates a striking understanding of crowd psychology. The bow contest was not only a test for Odysseus, but also a brilliant way to divide the suitors. Until that moment, they had acted as a united force, united by a common goal. But the announcement of the contest instantly turned them from allies into rivals. Each wanted to be first. Each hoped that luck would smile on him. Their collective power crumbled into 108 individual ambitions. The moment the first of them, the most presumptuous, failed, followed by the second and third, their confidence began to melt away. Penelope did not simply give them an impossible task. She forced them to publicly demonstrate their inadequacy, their inability to live up to the heroic image of Odysseus. She humiliated them morally, even before Odysseus destroyed them physically. She prepared the ground for the massacre by depriving the suitors of their main weapon, collective arrogance. And here it is worth paying attention to her interaction with Telemachus at this critical moment. When Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, asks to try his hand at archery, the suitors fly into a rage. A dangerous situation arises. And then Telemachus, her son, whom she raised and sent on a journey to find courage, makes his move. He imperiously orders his mother to retire to her chambers, declaring, "The bow is a man's business." At first glance, this is a classic manifestation of patriarchy. But in the context of what was happening, it was a brilliantly staged performance. Telemachus, acting in collusion with his father, publicly takes responsibility for what is happening, removing any suspicion from his mother. He seems to be saying to the suitors, "I am now in charge here." Penelope, submissively leaving, actually passes the baton to him at a decisive moment, ending her 20-year marathon to preserve power and transferring it to its rightful heirs. Her departure is not a sign of submission, but the final chord of her brilliant score. It is also important to consider alternative, lesser-known versions of the myths, which further reinforce the image of these women as strong and independent figures. There are legends that after Odysseus' death, Penelope married Telegonus, the son of Odysseus and the sorceress Circe. In this union, she not only found a new protector, but also gained immortality, moving with her husband to the islands of the blessed. This version completely breaks the image of the eternal grieving widow, showing a woman who, after fulfilling her duty to Ithaca, chooses a new, happy, and even divine destiny for herself. She did not remain tied to the past, but stepped into eternity on her own terms. There are also nuances for Andromache. Her confrontation with Hermione was not just a domestic quarrel between two women. It was a clash between two civilizations, two worldviews. Hermione, a Spartan, embodied the rough, straightforward strength of the victors.
Andromache, a Trojan, represented a more ancient, refined culture based on cunning and fortitude. And in this clash, it is Andromache, the captive, who demonstrates greater dignity and moral superiority. Euripides, an Athenian playwright, wrote his tragedy at the height of the Peloponnesian War with Sparta. In the image of the cruel and narrow-minded Hermione, the Athenian public easily recognized a caricature of their Spartan enemies. And in the noble and suffering Andromache, they saw a symbol of indomitable spirit. Thus, Andromache transformed from a personal character into a powerful political symbol, her story becoming an instrument of cultural and ideological struggle. Ultimately, both Andromache and Penelope show us that power takes many forms. In a world where men possessed physical strength, the right to wage war and speak publicly, these women mastered other types of power. The power of information, the power of patience, the power of psychological manipulation, the power of moral authority, and, most importantly, the power over time. Penelope stretched out time, gaining years. Andromache, having outlived her time, projected herself into the future through her descendants. They both understood a fundamental truth. Whoever controls the narrative, whoever sets the rules of the game, even without a sword in their hands, ultimately becomes the real winner. Their stories are not lamentations about loss, but epics of rebirth, proving that the most durable throne is one built not on stones, but on the power of human intellect and will. We need to delve deeper into the very nature of the power they regained. It was not a simple copying of the male model of rule based on force and direct command. They created and used alternative, more subtle, and perhaps more durable forms of influence.
Penelope, for example, fought not just for the throne, but for the preservation of the very concept of oikos, the Greek home as an orderly universe comprising family, property, slaves, traditions, and divine patronage. The suitors were not just contenders, they were entropy, chaos that was consuming her world from within. Every day she won was a victory of order over decay. Her loom was not just a trick, it was a miniature universe where, like the Moirai, she wove and unraveled the thread of her home's destiny, preventing it from sinking into oblivion. Every day she won was a victory of order over decay. Her loom was not just a trick, it was a miniature universe where, like the Moirai, she wove and unraveled the thread of her home's destiny, preventing it from sinking into oblivion. It was the perfect test of loyalty, of belonging to her world and her values. She did not ask, "Are you with me or with them?" She created a situation in which the answer revealed itself without a single direct word. It was a level of political intrigue that Machiavelli would have envied. She controlled information, turning it into a weapon and a tool for testing. Her main strength lay in her masterful use of uncertainty. She never gave her suitors a definitive answer, keeping them under the illusion that they still had a chance. This ambiguity was her main shield. A direct refusal would have provoked violence and an immediate seizure of power. Direct consent would have meant capitulation. Penelope chose a third way, a path of fog and delays that wore down her enemies psychologically. She forced them to live in constant anticipation, which dulled their resolve and fueled internal strife. They could not unite to take decisive action because each secretly hoped that he would be the one chosen. She did not fight their strength, she directed it against each other, allowing their own vanity and greed to do her work for her. Andromache, in turn, mastered the art of controlling memory. When Virgil describes her meeting with Aeneas in Epirus, she appears not simply as a grieving widow. She is a living archive, a walking encyclopedia of the lost city of Troy. She does not simply remember the past, she reconstructs it and passes it on. She asks Aeneas about his son Ascanius, comparing him to her own lost son Astyanax. This simple question carries enormous meaning. She connects the past, her son, with the future, Aeneas's son, symbolically passing on the torch of Trojan glory. She becomes the high priestess of Trojan identity, confirming the legitimacy of Aeneas's mission. Her words are not just memories, they are a blessing and a political act, affirming the spiritual continuity between ancient Troy and future Rome. Deprived of her physical homeland, she created a homeland in narrative, in the history she preserved and passed on. It is interesting to contrast her with Helen. Both women lost their first home and found themselves in a foreign land. But while Helen, the cause of the war, remains a rather passive figure throughout the epic, an object for which men fight, Andromache, a victim of war, is constantly active. Helen adapts to circumstances, returning to Menelaus as if nothing had happened. Andromache, on the other hand, transforms circumstances, building a new kingdom from the ruins of her fate. She is the anti-Helen. Her beauty was not in her appearance, but in her unyielding loyalty and active virtue. If Helen's beauty brought destruction, Andromache's virtue brought creation.
She proved that true power lies not in the ability to inspire men to battle, but in the ability to build peace after men have finished fighting. Even her public grief in Epirus can be seen as a political tool. By constantly mourning Hector and Troy, she and Helen asserted their legitimacy as the true heirs to the fallen kingdom. Their court was not just the residence of rulers, it was a memorial, a place of pilgrimage for all who remained loyal to the Trojan cause. This cult of the past gave their power a sacred, holy character. Their rule was not simply a seizure of territory, it was an act of historical justice, a continuation of an interrupted tradition. Thus, Andromache's tears became part of the state ideology, cementing the new society and distinguishing it from the surrounding Greek tribes. Returning to Penelope, it is worth noting her cold-headedness even in the moment of triumph. When Euryclea informs her that Odysseus has returned and killed the suitors, her first reaction is disbelief. She suggests that it could have been some god who took the form of her husband to punish the wicked. This is not just female caution. It is the thinking of a person who has lived under siege for 20 years, accustomed to deception and betrayal, and who knows that the biggest mistake is to believe in a miracle too quickly. She does not allow her emotions to take precedence over her reason. Before recognizing her husband as the victor, she must subject him to one last, most rigorous test, a test of authenticity. Her skepticism, honed by years of loneliness and struggle, was her last line of defense. She had to make sure that she was not just looking at a warrior who had regained his throne, but the very man with whom she had shared the intimate secrets of their marriage bed. Only then did she allow herself to become a wife again, having completed her mission to preserve the oikos and handed it over to its rightful owner, but now as an equal, victorious partner. Penelope's strategy was also an act of foreign policy at the highest level. Among her suitors were not just local aristocrats, but nobles and princes from neighboring islands and territories. Had she chosen one, she would have immediately turned the other 107 into offended enemies, ready to wage war against her new husband and a weakened Ithaca. By maintaining a delicate balance and giving no one an advantage, she essentially held the entire regional politics hostage, preventing the collapse of her kingdom in internecine strife. Her inaction was a form of preserving sovereignty. Andromache's power in Epirus manifested itself in an act of sacred naming. By giving new geographical features old Trojan names, the river Xanthus, the Scaean Gate, she was performing more than just a nostalgic ritual. It was a magical and political act, a transfer of spiritual essence, the genius loci, to a new land. She did not allow the Greeks to erase Troy from the map of the world. She transferred its metaphysical copy, declaring that the true Troy was where its memory and its queen lived on. It was a victory in a cultural war, won after military defeat. Her demand for gifts from suitors can be seen as a brilliant economic diversion, a kind of reverse dowry. In a system where the bride brings wealth into her husband's home, Penelope turned the rules upside down. She forced potential husbands to pour resources into her home even before any agreement was reached. She did not simply compensate for the losses from their feasts, she made them pay tribute for the very opportunity to be in her palace, turning them from invaders into supplicants. We must not forget the power of Andromache's silence, described by Euripides. Her stoic, restrained grief against the backdrop of the loud lamentations of the other Trojan women was a form of passive resistance, a refusal to give the victors the spectacle of complete devastation. And Penelope's final test with the bed is, in essence, a legal act. In a world without written contracts, shared secret knowledge was the highest confirmation of identity and rights. She forced Odysseus to ratify their marriage union anew, before the court of her own memory, putting the final seal on its legitimacy. Andromache and Penelope proved that even in an era of male domination, women could use strategy, patience, and intelligence to regain power. Their stories, based on mythological sources, remain relevant today, reminding us of the power of spirit and the ability to turn defeat into victory. These examples inspire reflection on gender roles and personal resilience in the modern world.